Meeting to order at 6:30. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll do roll call, please.
George Cullis.
Yes.
Karen Winchester here. Mark Freeman.
Here.
Derek Burton.
Here.
Steve Ruth.
Here.
Agenda approval. Chair would entertain a motion.
So moved.
Support.
Moved by Clerk Winchester, support by Trustee Burton to approve the agenda. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 5-0. Public comment on agenda items only. Members of the public can address the board on agenda items only. Once recognized by the supervisor, comments are limited to a maximum of 3 minutes. The board may extend this time by a majority vote. Prior to addressing the board, members of the public shall state their name, address for the record. A second public comment is available at the end of the meeting because we don't have new business. Mr. Kinnaman? Are you here for public comment?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, so we will go on to business. This is a workshop, just to clarify. There will be no decisions made this evening. This is strictly giving us an opportunity for Mr. Scott Reynolds to make a presentation on our needs assessment project that he's been working on. And it'll give the board just kind of a relaxed opportunity to ask questions, talk about it. And we don't have any decisions until we get to the board meetings. So, Mr. Reynolds, I'm going to let you
Very much.
have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Cullis. My name is Scott Reynolds. I'm an associate with Augerstein Aller Architects. We're a Metro Detroit architecture firm. Been working with communities like yourselves for about 30 years. We've done a number of municipal projects, including a number of which with Oakland County, which is how you guys were initially introduced to us. You guys were interested in the idea of potentially either expanding or building new municipal offices, which is kind of where we started here with this needs assessment report. I do have a kind of general outline of what we would go through this evening, which is, in summary, a PowerPoint presentation that kind of summarizes some of the thoughts. I'm going to thumb through that. I appreciate you guys coming together tonight. This is meant to be conversational. Obviously, there's some discussions to be had. Bigger picture, this is kind of the initial small step in the direction of considering a new facility. Bigger picture-wise, this would be considering the idea of what the recipe, if you would say, for the building would be. How much space do you need? What kind of space do you need? And understanding where the next steps would come from. So just as a general overview, obviously this report involves yourselves as the board of Holly Township, and it also includes your staff and also takes considerations of where Holly Township, from an operational standpoint, staffing, department layouts would be considered in the near future. That's a combination of not only interviews with staff members, but also comparisons of essentially professional recommendations and studies that we would go to from a baseline, let's say, for square footages. And then it also would consider our professional experience in doing various village halls, township halls, from start to finish. That includes, so just a general overview, we'll talk about kind of the goals of this study. This was the big picture, right? An architectural process is not going to be the small, defined answer of what the countertop is or the color on the walls is not going to be asked right now. That's a step that's further down the line. Right now we're trying to understand the scale and the needs that Holly Township would potentially need to consider a new facility. We'll go through a couple of key considerations, which is a factor of what you guys are as a community, where you guys see yourself going in the future, and then also talking about some next steps about how the project would evolve moving forward if you choose to do so. So as I mentioned, this process involves everyone here sitting here today. We take a deep dive into the history of who you guys are as a community, both how you interact with the township and the village, the number of different jurisdictions or I guess governing bodies that you have here within the township, understanding how your emergency services are established, the idea that you currently here have a 5-person board, the discussion of, would that change in the future based on, growth in the community, further development, all of those factors are things that we're looking at from a high-level standpoint. Big picture, we took a look at the history of downtown. Obviously, you have a cultural, a very rich cultural presence here in this community, and that's an amazing thing for you guys to build upon. With nonetheless of the current facility that you guys are in now, the Holly Hall, which was, a joining partnership between the township and the village. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that process, but just that is one factor that we look at. It isn't just, it's to be open-minded about where we could go with this project. Same thing that we'd consider is all of your natural amenities that you have in the township. Where do we see population growth? The report itself obviously gets a little further in depth on this, but in general of talking about the key opportunities that you have in the downtown and the idea that some of these other properties like the Heritage Farmstead site might be somewhere where we continue to look at where a new municipal complex could go. So speaking of which, that was some of the groundings that we started to look at with this study to understand what the possibility was of the Holly Heritage Farmstead site. The fact that potentially a building being proposed here could be a critical, catalyst to that development and building upon the needs and hopefully inspiring the other activities and renovations that might exist. The existing South House being converted as the master plan lays out. The idea of the event barn, which is obviously well underway of renovations, but how could another building on that site become kind of that catalyst to the other activities that could evolve with that property? So with that said, the bigger idea of this master plan, we're talking about the one component here, bigger picture. We haven't settled exactly where or how or what this building would be, but the bigger picture of idea how big this would be and what components that this building need to withhold. That is what we're here to discuss here tonight. So kind of getting into that recipe idea, we dug into what would be every department and their needs, what their current needs are, what their future needs are, and talking about different roles and accommodations that each role would play. So I know a lot of these are numbers. There's a lot of items that might be easily lost in. This is a tool that we're using that we're hopefully can easily translate to you. So I'm going to walk through a couple components of that. So one would be obviously from a row standpoint, you have the role or the space in which the general department which would use. So the colors follow suit through the colored plans and also talk about every department within the township as it sits right now and potentially considers other departments that we'll get into here in just a short few minutes. But for example, the township supervisor, there's the supervisor himself. There's the existing space in which he's utilizing from an occupancy load standpoint and a square footage load. So those are a couple of factors that we'll dig into here that you'll see some numbers that there are some departments that are projected to grow and there's others that are going to shrink, maybe because of role changes, department changes, but also some of it is right sizing some of those spaces, right? Instead of an overly large office, providing a sized office for the needs that are actually present and then providing that square footage to another function within the building. So proposed, as you can see here following this line through, you can see how the proposed square footage is actually a little less. That's where I was mentioning those kind of professional guidelines that we use as general spacing and sizing. And then ultimately what kind of space is needed within that. Is it a closed office? Is it an open office? To start to understand, okay, an open office is going to be less square footage, a closed office is going to be more, but obviously privacy might be required by the role or the operational function of that department. And not to mention, there'll be some comments here. You'll see throughout that there's some professional recommendations that I'm making from our experience and obviously our interviews, which prompts some, kind of future discussions for yourselves as the Board of Trustees and also, with your department heads. So with that said, let's go through the township supervisor. Currently, most of these roles exist from the township supervisor and administrative assistant. Obviously, that position right now is kind of dual kept and is in a is also code enforcement, as you guys are familiar with. But both of those are in two larger offices, right? And there isn't the other functions like a potentially a meeting area for the supervisor or a common work area for things to happen. Some of these functions will be spread throughout the building as a common function. Others will be designated directly for a department. So as I can't use my laser here on the screen, but you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner how proposed there's about existing there's 648 square feet, and we're proposing essentially 576 square feet. So it's actually reducing by 11%. So some of that's because of the existing building that you guys are within, and we'll review some of these plans here. We've made the existing building work, which is great. But actually talking about what is really needed, that's where you're seeing these proposed numbers change. So this would be, actual calculations versus, how it's fitting within the building footprint. Clerk's department, go ahead, Mr. Quest.
Can I back you up?
Yep.
I'm doing the math, and when I see it says a work table, 20 square feet.
Yep.
If you take 5 by 5, that's 25 square. So that's just
Correct. So some of these square footages, that's a very valid point. So it's not about it being a 20 square foot work table. It's rather like, let's say, a common, maybe off of a corridor, there is some cabinets with a printer, right? It might not be a completely separate room, but those items we're accounting for kind of that bonus square footage. And there is going to be some rework. So while we're looking at these numbers, you can see that the actual number is 480 square feet. There actually is a general factor in which I'm using at this level in the process to factor in some additional square footage that would be used towards common uses and circulation. So that also kind of factors in to benefit that 20 square feet. Oh, I'm going the wrong way here. So moving forward with the clerk's department, that would be an example of one department that there is a number of needs that we foresee changing as time proceeds in the township. Karen's done a wonderful job at not only being the clerk, but also handling voting, handling the building department, handling zoning, right? Those are all things within her role, or should I say the clerk's department. So you can see here in the first couple of roles, I've noted that it's the current role includes planning and zoning administrator, and then the deputy clerk also includes the building department, right? So from that point where Christy's playing both of those roles, those could be things that change in the future. So you can see here in that general calculation as you go down this list, we're accounting for square footage like voting and polling. Yes, we're going to double dip on some of those square footages and hopefully maximize every dollar spent within the building in the future. But we also need to account for things like active records, which right now are upstairs. Some are unsecure, they're not in their rightful place, and including things that are off-site, right? So, we're accounting for some square footage that is currently not within Holly Hall that we would want to bring into this building, so all of those functions are present. So right now, the clerk's department has about 640 square feet. We're projecting that to grow to about 1570. Now keep in mind that that's not all main floor space. Some of that would be maybe space in the basement, or maybe an area within this future building that would be separated because it isn't needed day to day, but that space is needed because it's a service and a function that's required by the township. Moving along to the treasurer's office, very similar conversation, maybe less in the sake of pulling roles out of the clerk's department, but Mark, obviously there's the treasurer here now, and you have the deputy treasurer. There's discussions that there might be a future, deputy treasurer, maybe part-time, but we need to factor in a seat. Where's that person going to sit? Is it going to be a desk that gets shared between a couple part-time roles? And that's why that's calculated as an open office component. It's not a closed-in office. So keep in mind that this is just the bigger picture idea. How these, names or roles get assigned to offices or workstations will happen as the project would further develop. So that would be a great example here, the deputy treasurer too. You know, based on interviews that I had with Mark and Suzanne, is to say what would be needed in the future, and that was a concept that could present itself. That doesn't mean that it's day 2. It doesn't mean that it's even in 2 years. It means that it might be in 10 years. It could even be a little ways out from that. But you know, a building would be an investment of typically 50 years. So we don't want to be looking at only year 5 or 1 through 5. We want to be looking the bigger picture. So that's why you're seeing some of these calculations being provided. So in many ways, we are providing seats for future roles. But keep in mind that I don't foresee all those roles being here today. It's for the idea that they need to be factored into this kind of 50-year community investment that you're looking to potentially make. Same thing goes for active records and archive records. Typically, active records would be within the general room. Archive is going to be something that might be in the basement in a secure location. So for example, a little less growth than the clerk's department, no less important, but obviously from 360 square feet to 600 square feet. Board of Trustees, obviously we're sitting here today and not your guys' building, but rather a community resource that's being shared. So I think that's great, and we see that in many communities. But what other spaces would potentially be offered? So right now I am factoring in the existing square footage that was utilized upstairs. Obviously that is not your current meeting location, but it is a space within that building that's about 570 square feet. We would see that growing a little bit more to provide kind of modern amenities. By the time you have technology woven in, you know, a large board area, guest seating, you're going to need some more space, especially, you know, handicap compliance and all of those areas. It's going to be a little bit bigger room. So you'll see here that obviously there's a pretty significant growth factor on that. I guess we would call a department or program item, but that's mainly just because I think you've already accepted maybe that you've outgrown or that space isn't fitting to you. Now getting into number 5, which is the building department, right? This is a department that in many ways does exist right now from inspections, code enforcement, and permit reviews, right? But those people don't necessarily have a full-time seat in your current facility. From our professional experience, right, we know what's on the horizon for the community. We know that it is going to be something that at some point can't just be handled solely by the clerk and the clerk's deputy. That's going to be someone that probably is going to be brought in to be another department head, you know, and maybe there would have to be a clerk in that role. Same thing goes with obviously the inspectors as you see down the list. Now, I see a lot of those roles being, you know, potentially part-time in the near future, as many of those are currently, and maybe they're a shared kind of workspace type of a situation versus a fully devoted one office that is empty, you know, 5 out of 6 days of the week. There would obviously be active records that right now is kind of upstairs in common space, maybe a little convoluted with the clerk's department, or, you know, in the corner of the trustee space. And from a professional recommendation standpoint, we would recommend that obviously that go to designated space so you can make sure you know, we're adhering to all of your needs and your future needs. Planning and zoning is something very similar to the building department, right? Right now that is a role that's within the clerk's responsibilities. We would see that changing in the future, right? That would probably need to have an office and maybe another you know, clerk seat there. I think that could be you know, an open office setting, but they would also need their own records and archival record spaces. Same thing goes with code enforcement. Typically we do see that in kind of a balance of either in planning and zoning or the building department more likely, but nonetheless it is a individualized role that currently right now is split between assisting the supervisor and also code enforcement. So you can see here that there's a number of roles that I'm suggesting that doesn't mean I think are here, you know, tomorrow, but I think there are things to consider in this new facility. And not to, you know, there's also non-department needs within this building. There's a general factor of circulation and spatial needs, but bigger picture, right, is there additional meeting rooms? You know, right now, the current facility, we're kind of fighting for space. You know, everyone's fighting over the one conference room or hoping to meet at the small table behind Karen's desk, right? So hopefully we can kind of bridge that gap a little bit better, provide better services to residents within reason. And I think there's a need for not only kind of front of house public meeting rooms, but also we find some back of house staff meeting rooms. Sometimes those are utilized when, let's say there's voter notices going out or various pieces that might be taken over as kind of a pseudo workroom, to gain a little bit of space. Obviously public restrooms and staff restrooms, those are all items part of the list. But I think that's, kind of hits the bigger picture needs that we have here now. So what that leads us to is effectively you're utilizing about 3,600 square feet of the existing building. Now, that doesn't mean that the existing building is only 3,600 square feet. The existing building is actually closer to 6,400. Now, why that usage number is a little bit different is because not all parts of that building is really being utilized 100%. Now, that doesn't mean that the staff for the township hasn't tried. It's mainly due to limitations within that historic building, right? There would have to be significant renovations in some of those areas to really gain that square footage. Second floor is a perfect example, right? We kind of made it work with what we have. So you're gonna see a lot more, I guess, efficiency per square foot utilized in either a renovated or a new facility. So in conclusion, what we come up with is your general program needs are about 7,500 square feet, and I'm recommending, probably a little extra there, so you're probably close to that 7,900 or 8,000 square foot range for the building. Now keep in mind that that number doesn't factor in some of these other considerations that the Heritage Farmstead Master Plan looked at. So I think there are some other factors to take a look at here. Right now, we know that there isn't a formal DPW department within the township. We know that might be something to consider to elaborate on this function. Maybe that isn't a role per se yet, but it's a function that needs to be included in the building, maybe a small garage, maybe it's part of the basement, something along those lines. The other factor to consider is what other program functions could the township offices provide that would be a community benefit, especially if the Heritage Farm site was to be considered. So additional meeting rooms, right? And those would be double dipped between maybe it's elections and, community functions. So that would increase that number. Potentially, if you're looking at an 8,000 square foot building, we would try and put that building in a basement to gain that kind of bonus square footage. And then potentially put a partial second floor in that building. So you might be looking at something like 10 to 12,000 square feet, only for the general bigger picture of what could the township, have a little space to grow into. So feel free to stop me if you got questions. I'm sure we can circle back to all of these in greater detail. So if I'm losing anyone, feel free to stop me. So with that said, as I mentioned, I think you're closer to that 8,000 square foot building mark. That could be phased, depending on how the building were to evolve in future phases. We could consider additions or consider only building out partial spaces. You're going to get the greatest value for your dollar invested up front by kind of doing the most together. When you start to piece it, you're going to have those startup costs again. As I mentioned previously, you're utilizing about 3,600 square feet, but again, that's not because staff hasn't made a great attempt. It's limitations within that building. Needs, would be right-sized spaces. George's office, although, great, and there's a lot of amazing pieces to that, it's probably just a little too big, right? If that was a little bit smaller and he took some of that square footage and some of these other offices were right-sized, then we gain another conference room, right? Or better yet, a right-sized conference room, somewhere where you can actually fit, 6 to 8 people in it. So that's some of the discussions that we're having here, that there isn't just this massive, hey, we need double the space. It is factored within reasonable, professional area recommendations for what an office should be. Number 3 on that list, area for new departments and staff, right? We want to be looking at not just today, but in the future. And then, the 4th item, promoting an efficient, effective operation layout, right? Right now we have departments that are kind of stuck, and separated, and, if I go see Mark to pay my tax bill, I don't really know that Karen's around the corner, to go pick up my voter registration card. So we took these numbers, right, and all of this mumbo jumbo that I, spent plenty of time putting together, right, would be as these plans. So this is how for the most part, the building is utilized now. So in the middle there, you have the main floor, you have the basement on the right, and then you have the second floor on the left. So you can see some of that scale of the existing building. You can see how much gray area is present. There's a lot of space that's not exactly fully activated. Talking about that effective use of space, there's some of that could be better utilized. But again, it's a building that's over 100 years old. There's going to be some limitations there. So when we do take a look at some of those program functions, one thing to consider is the dotted boxes are essentially the program, or what we would call the future uses. The solid boxes would be what you have currently. So there's a lot going on here in this township. It isn't just a forward growth. There's some rearranging of departments. So when you take the township supervisor, there's a slight, you can see the solid box now. It's larger, but it also has code enforcement in it. When that comes out of that department, that program box shrinks a little bit. So you can see how some of these are talking about that right size discussion. The clerk's department has not only planning and zoning, but also the building department, so it looks like a very big box, but those are going to come out to be their own separate function, and then that expansion of the clerk's office, those departments coming out of it are being absorbed and providing some of that additional space that's required because we're creating new departments. Same thing, with all these other departments, they're a little more straightforward. Board of Trustees growing, the treasurer's office, kind of general space between some of those. You'll see the general spaces, what we would call, meeting spaces, some of those restroom amenities. We know there's probably going to be some additional mechanical space, just knowing that it would be a modern building. And then also, off-site storage that we're trying to include within, and that's why the clerk's kind of overall gets that bigger growth factors for election storage. So when we apply that to the current building, keep in mind that these are just high-level graphics, right? We're not trying to say that we're moving out to the street and we're moving on to Main Street. It's purely just the discussion of how the boxes fit within the current building. And you can see here quickly that, yes, there's some of that gray area, but after you expand these boxes, it doesn't leave much space for all of the functions that are required from here on out in the township. What would be created is, if we were to consider other opportunities for this building. I've worked with a number of municipalities that have seen growth just like you have in Holly. This could be a key consideration for an economic investment within your community. Maybe this building is better fit for a mixed-use development. Maybe it is a restaurant. Maybe there's some additional housing or lofts. Where you see in our report kind of some of my conclusions is it's going to always be this difficult puzzle to put together when you're looking at the Holly Hall. It's a great building, but let's say we move, Board of Trustees out, or we move planning and zoning upstairs. You want a nice, ceiling that has acoustics in it. You want to have meeting rooms that don't have that nice 20-foot ceiling. So I'd hate to see a renovation that essentially doesn't take the opportunity of that building to its fullest extent, just because we're trying to fit a municipal office function within a building that might be better fit for other opportunities. Now, that's just my observation. There's obviously many discussions to be had about that. I think there are many other communities that you could look at as a partner and as an example. Village of Lake Orion, I worked with,
Chris Barnett?
No, Mr. Narsh. Sorry, Jerry Narsh. I couldn't think of his name right here and there. Obviously, was the police chief of Village Hall. I did that Village Hall project with him. They moved up the street to a building that they could renovate and better fit, that gave them more space and a more opportune layout. And that by moving out of their building downtown, not only was it a better location for someone else, they found that they had the parking lot that they needed. They had the space for their police vehicles. We're not talking about police necessarily here, but my point is that change that they decided to make created the opportunity for another restaurant and another catalyst within their downtown that's quite successful, and as you've seen a great resurgence in the village of Lake Orion because of some of those moves that the government took to move their investment or move their space because they knew we're not the best fit for that location. So as just an example, again, this is a high-level thinking process, but if you were to propose a new building, when you see here, this is the same size of boxes, but you're looking at them in a new building layout. A layout that would be conducive for future expansion. You're going to be able to right-size spaces. Departments are going to be organized in a logical way instead of how they have to fit within the historic building, within bearing walls and other limitations. That's one huge benefit to considering a new building, and I think that's something you guys have already considered just because of the Heritage Farm Site Master Plan. So high level, right, this is just one thought, but there's a lot of different iterations we could go through with this, and obviously future phases would further develop this from bubble diagrams to walls and offices, and we could start to put roles within locations and desks. But just the logical thought process that the public is on the one side of the building, the staff is on the other, there's plenty of meeting spaces, there could potentially be a bit, an upper level that would allow for future uses, those community classroom spaces. Maybe it creates a nice space for a nice boardroom that could be used for community meetings, HOA meetings. All of those kind of functions would be great assets for the township to invest in to provide its residents. And then the hope would be is to put this building on a full basement. There typically is a good, I guess, value per dollar invested in putting a building on a basement. We're all familiar with that, probably living in Michigan, but you can see here that it leaves some area to grow. Maybe there's a chance on the heritage site for this to be a partial walkout, or maybe this is a garage for DPW down the road. Typically in a facility that I just completed in Orion Township, the basement was actually a 14-foot clear distance from floor to floor, which meant there was about 12 feet of ceiling space below lights and HVAC, which meant that could be fully programmed for offices in the future or a community function. So those are all things to think about, and that we would work with you guys moving forward to say what is it and what is the best value for any dollar invested. So a couple of big pictures, and we can go back through this. Bigger picture, this process takes time. You guys are, what we would start with is kind of the pre-design phase, so it's early on. But overall, this process is going to take, a couple of years, or better yet, almost 3 to probably get you into the building. It isn't just, keep in mind that I'm not putting these in here because I'm doing work for 8 months straight, but there needs to be community input. There needs to be discussions. There needs to be time for those things to go back and forth. So I'd encourage you to think about that, as time moves forward. The architectural process is broken down into reasonable steps, so all of those questions aren't up front. I work with the staff. Karen, there's a number of things that I'm sure you're questioning or hoping gets, rectified in this plan. And the structure of a typical architectural process allows for kind of big picture questions and then work our way through to the most detailed ones. So just a couple of notes here, and I have another diagram that might be a better example to explain this, but you guys are completing some of this pre-design due diligence, right? The Heritage Farmstead site has some dollars being invested to it now to do soil borings and what we would call a geotechnical investigation. So making sure that we're not building on a swamp, or making sure that we're feasibly could put a basement on this site, and that is a factor we could consider. Versus, hey, if we need space for a DPW in the future, we need to plan for a one-story addition that's slab on grade. So those are all great things to consider. The next step where we would be looking at would be schematic design. There's a few other phases, design development, so I'm going to go into those, and the next slide is a little better example. But keep in mind that the CM bid and construction process could be a year to a year and a half. And keep in mind that would be after those construction documents are completed. So you have a good solid year of design efforts that would have to be worked through Not to mention if there's any financing considerations, things that would have to go to a public vote, those would all be things that would add to this timeline. But the construction manager, which would be our recommendation, that would be a person that would oversee and then publicly bid the project. That would be a process within itself. You'd enter into most likely a guaranteed maximum price with them, and then they would start construction. So that's a good year out, so that's where you're getting kind of that 24 months is 12 months for design and about 12 months to build it at least, and you're only going to probably grow a little bit further. And there's going to be time for moving, coordination, and then close out. There's obviously little nitty-gritty details that we need to work through within this building. Bigger picture standpoint, that puts you in June of 2024 or May of 2025, just for a scale, sense of scale. Oh boy, okay, this is, all right, so I didn't realize that this had a little bit of motion, but that works out for me. So there's multiple steps within the architectural process. So real quick, right now we're at the pre-design, right? So we're about 5% through the project sitting here today. What is the recipe for the project? What is our needs? What are our wants? What are some of the goals? Preparing those bubble diagrams and understanding relationships of space. Talking big picture, what could be, the project budget and where do we go from here? Next step would be schematic design. That's still kind of a next baby step of working through the design. We're going to start making the building look a lot more real. We're going to take a look at the site plan. Where's parking in relationship to the front door? Where's the restrooms? Is there a different staff restroom from the public restroom? Those are all questions that we're going to ask. Along with doing a little bit more in-depth of a site analysis. So that's your next step if you were to consider moving forward with this process. General overview, there's a few more steps along the way, and these are broken down in reasonable chunks. So that way there's time to reevaluate the budget, to discuss, to pause, to have further discussions. So once we have this bigger picture in schematic design development would be that next phase to really get into, okay, it is a it's a craftsman furnace, right? And it's all of these specific components are going to be further developed and defined in that project scope. And better yet, that would be provided for potentially if you decided to go with the construction manager route, that would give them the opportunity to kind of further look at this and say, yep, we're on budget, we're on track, or this is the number of what you've asked for in your plans. Now, after that whole design process is done, there's a budget check at design development, would lead us to construction documents. Now, that's kind of where we put our heads down. There's obviously check-ins with you as the client, but we're essentially translating those pretty pictures into technical documents. They're going to be translated into permits. They're going to be translated into all of those design details, how to construct the windowsill, right? And how to construct the eave detail, or if there happen to be glue lamps on the project, how does it meet and what does that kind of cool factor of that building look, and how are they going to execute that as a contractor? And those are actually your, I guess, legal documents that would be entered into a scope to say, Scott Reynolds or better yet, Auger Klein Aller Architects has prepared these drawings for us. The contractor has bid them. They say it's X amount of dollars. We all agree that this is what's being constructed. So it's kind of a checks and balances phase. Last but not least, there would be kind of that bidding, and part of that bidding and construction document phase is that engagement of the construction manager. And in that process ends up with us overviewing the project and assisting you in that process, but also making sure that when there are issues that come up, we're working through that. We know even the most perfect projects, there's going to be things that are unforeseen. We came into this pile of rubble under 2 feet under the ground, right? But we're going to work through that with the construction team and make sure it's executed. And then toward the bottom of the list, right, it's to understand kind of, all right, the building is constructed per the contract documents. There's some checks and balances. So I know this is a lot to throw at you this evening and a lot to discuss, but I wanted to give you some overall of where we're headed. I didn't realize I had some fancy motions in my PowerPoint here. So just to reiterate, you're in that pre-design phase, and we would be moving towards the schematic design phase. So with that said, I know that's a lot of information, but I'm here, as it being a workshop, to have this be conversational. So I thank you for your time. I apologize if I was long-winded, but a lot of information to give you guys. So let's discuss whatever pieces of the puzzle you would like to dig into further and talk about where you want to go from here.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now I'll turn to the board and see who has questions for Mr. Reynolds.
Okay, so the first question I have, I wanted to check with you first before I go ahead and ask any questions. We have this schematic design information in front of us. Under item 7, it says acceptance, and it basically says do not disclose the information, so do you want me to handle this with you privately, the questions that I have regarding this?
Specifically to our schematic design proposal?
Yeah.
So yes, I can handle any of those. We can work through if there's discrepancies or issues that you have specifically with entering into a contract for next phase services. Just so you know, we would start to follow that is our kind of formal SD proposal. But talking about this process, we would likely engage the American Institute of Architects contract documents solution, and that's typical for a government project, so there would be some additional, details that would go in along with that too.
Okay, because some of the questions I had relating to this, but it appears that as I read acceptance, that me asking you questions about this would then disclose the information.
Yeah, you're applying for, so we're bringing you forth. We are a co-op vendor through Oakland County Services. So because we're not only a vendor service for Oakland County, you're adhering to your public bid guidelines using us because of that relationship that we have. So some of those terminology that is in that, it might be part of that. So if there's specific things that you're worried about, we're happy to work through any of them. I just would have to go back and kind of review those further contract documents to make sure we're adhering to your common law kind of adoption, and then also just from the Oakland County Co-op vendor standpoint too.
Okay.
So I don't know if that helps guide you, or
We would be doing that when we actually look at your bid.
Correct. So you do have a proposal here this evening?
No, we don't. No, that goes on next
Okay.
week.
All right.
So we don't have the proposal. This is just the workshop.
Okay. Yep. So if there is a proposal to be set forth for you guys at your next meeting to deliberate on. So if there is questions, I can make sure that any of the concerns get answered before any contract is executed.
Okay.
Did anybody have any questions on the actual needs assessment itself, the concept?
So the only other thing I had is related to this. There's no doubt, obviously, we need to get out of this town hall. But as I thought about it, when this first started, I was like, that's a great idea. I love that idea, putting a building out there. But as I thought about it, I've lived here 7 years. I've gone to the Township Hall one time. So I was just looking, is there maybe more cost-effective things that we could be looking at instead of building a new building? And I know that we've even discussed, and I think the village was moving into what is now currently the middle school.
Yeah, we're still waiting for the schools.
Okay.
They're not at that phase yet.
Mm-hmm.
We were told by Steve Lennar that at some point we would receive an invitation to go look at the space available there, along with contractual issues that might be in front of it. We've not heard from him. I know Mr. Kinneman's with us in the audience. Do you know anything on a time frame for that? I refer to Mr. Kinneman.
For your visit, you mean?
Yeah, before you answer that question, though, because we're on video, I'm referring to you because your position with the schools is?
Director of Community Connections, which is the rental division, basically, of the school district. So I would possibly be involved in that process to some extent. This may be a little bit deeper than the level that I work with, but it's still the space that is being considered at the middle school is kind of within what would be areas that I would have oversight of at least a little bit, so.
But have you heard any purview as to a time frame as to when they're going to start looking at that?
I have not.
Okay.
So just so I understand, is what is happening with this school scenario, or is the school is going to maintain ownership of the middle school?
Yes.
So that we would, if that was the route we decided to go, we'd be paying rent to the school to have the space.
Yeah, we'd be paying for the
Yeah.
space. And one of the problems,
One of our big, yeah.
one of the problems with the current situation, because the Village of Holly rents space in this building here,
Mm.
and in their contract, they, with 6 months' notice, they can be told that they need to move out. Now, obviously, they're not going to leave this space until the new school's built, because eventually they're going to tear this down. But those are some of the concerns going forward.
Mhm.
I was hoping that the schools were going to look at more along the lines of condoing out the space,
Mhm.
but we've not heard what their plans are for that at this point. If it's a matter of shared space, but they have total control over the building, then that's a little different consideration
Yeah.
going in that we have to look at. As this community grows, the schools may be looking at the fact that they need that building down the road. I don't know. I've
There's
Could I-
concerns
could I
that it's very
comment
difficult
maybe
to
that
work with them.
One of the things that you're learning even through this process, you're looking at how much space you need
Mhm.
and what that may look like, may help you even in a visit to the middle school building and go, okay, we're talking about 8,000 square feet minimum, you know, what's 8,000 square feet look like at the middle school? You know, so to be mentally thinking that through, even if you just get a tour, you know,
right.
you know now what a conceptualization is of what you're gonna need. Is that doable at the middle school, you know, at that Sherman campus?
Right, we
so-
should determine that.
That kind of assessment, you know, it'd be great if the village did an assessment like that,
Mhm.
before taking a tour over there, just to have an understanding as well of what your needs really are.
You should mention that to one of the councilmen.
Yeah, maybe a councilman could,
Yeah, as one other couple of factors to consider, I would absolutely agree. You know, you want to consider all of your options within the community.
Mhm.
You know, a couple of considerations, and you know, I was speaking with George and Karen, and just promoting, taking a look at other municipalities and encouraging a conversation, bigger picture. Because, like I said, the Village of Lake Orion, you know, you have a similar nature, right? I've done the Village Hall of Lake Orion, and I've also just completed the new municipal hall for Orion Township. Now, Orion Township is a larger community, and they had a larger building, and they needed a larger building yet. Similar factor, you know, they needed about double the space that they had previously. Keep in mind, you know, a couple of things. The program study gives you that recipe of what we're looking for. Schematic design would be one factor that you could consider to talk a little bit more of, you know, walls and roof and layout, right? And get an idea of what that building is going to cost, because now you have a package of some concepts that you would be able to go to a construction manager and say, what is this going to cost if we decide to build this with you? You know, they would follow you through with that process. So, you know, as we go along, to say, bigger picture, we're going to make some assumptions, but it's going to cost you X dollars. You know, the other factor to consider about what you as a board decide to do, Orion Township decided not to build on their current site, take down their building or expand on it, because it was something that we were contracted to explore both options for. They decided to activate a parcel that was just north of their current building. It was actually 77 acres, to spend the money to put the road in, to put the infrastructure in, to put the parking in, because it acted as the starting off point of all the other components. And specifically for them, it was sports fields, additional community benefit. So there's some pros and cons to the different avenues that you might take. I think, you know, seeing the work that's been forth with the Heritage Farmstead site, you know, I think this building is very fitting for that site. Do I think it's the only option? No. Do I think it could provide a great opportunity as a springboard for that site to provide another great community asset? I definitely think so.
You know, and I just had the thought, as we grow and need this extra space, the schools are gonna be growing with us, and they're most likely are gonna want their space back. So I don't think it's a long-term solution, I think it would be a short-term solution.
It'd be a pretty big investment for a short term.
Right.
Yep.
Well, and that's,
Right, because we would have to spend how much to
To rent.
well, you've got a cost to
rent
retrofit the
and to
building.
retrofit the building to
And
to
it's an
meet
older
our
building, so
needs.
technology is an issue.
Well, technology, the
There's a
heating's an
reason they're
issue.
building a new building to start with.
Right.
Right,
Yeah, I would say there's a reason they're leaving that building.
right.
One of the things I wanted to mention, you touched base on Orion and the new building. I've had an opportunity to go through there, and I'd love to see our board tour that facility. Understand, it's far bigger than what we need. It's 50,000 square feet, I think.
Yep. Yep.
Gee.
Yep.
Well, but if
But-
you go into the
Yeah,
departments and
yeah.
look at them,
There's a couple other factors.
well,
that
but I was going
have
to say, but if you go into the
different- yes,
departments and look at them, the difference is the treasurer's office is here with 6 desks.
Yep.
We don't need 6. We know
Correct.
we don't need 6. You walk into the clerk's office is 9, I think.
Yeah, yep.
So there are a lot more spaces, but at the same time, Orion Township's a township. It's interesting when somebody say they're a bigger township. First of all the townships are 36 square miles.
Correct.
But the
Population.
population
Yep.
of Holly Township at 12,000 versus the population of Orion Township at 38,000
Yep,
is where you get the bigger
Yep.
township
for sure.
aspect. But you can still see, by going through that building, you still see flow.
Mhm.
You still see how they use space. Obviously, they have more space but they still have the departments we have. Theirs are just bigger.
Correct.
And so while I understand the footage,
Mhm.
but again, as you go through that building, they're not using all of that space right now.
Correct.
That building's geared for the next 50 years.
Right. And it's also geared for, so, as much as we want to say we're only going to ever grow, right? We're also considering factors of what else could the building be, if it ever becomes something else, right? When you have load-bearing walls, it's difficult to probably punch through this wall at CMU block, right? So a building that construction type we would propose would be, a steel column and beam building, right? Which means it's a pretty open footprint. And I mentioned it earlier about the idea of phasing, and understanding when some of these roles might come in. And I think that's a critical conversation because we would come back to all of those program diagrams and schematic design. But it's talking about also the future, right? So you could put this investment in a new building, but it could maybe, as things change in the future, create some community space, right? It's about moving some walls around. Yes, that's more investment for the future, but that building lends itself to that opportunity versus, you guys are in a historic building currently, load-bearing walls. Orion Township was in what we would call like a Class C commercial building, which is very similar to like a nice home construction, right? You couldn't really change that much. Where this building that they're in now, other than these main corridors, it's a pretty free spanning, you got a 20 by 20 bay. So you could rearrange departments, and I could get into those plans, in depth, right? Because I designed the building, but all of those departments kind of are just a different configuration within a bay, right? The treasurer's department needed a room for a safe. The planning department needed a plan room. Well, that could be shared with their DP, public works area. So they kind of took 2 storage rooms and made it into one big workspace that they could roll plans out with. So if in the future this building were to change, they're modifying some walls. If the clerk's department had to be 2 departments big, it would still work. It wasn't this stuck idea of you could never, grow beyond that wall. So that was, a huge factor that we considered designing that building, and we would do the same for you because we know that, not only today but in the near future, you're going to continue to evolve and maybe potentially double, the staff in the township.
I wanted to clarify one thing because when you sit and deal with this in multiple meetings, it becomes second nature. And you do this for a living. But I wanted you to go back. You said you were talking about this building as a steel frame
Yeah, so we would propose this building to be what would be type 2B. So it would be non-combustible materials, which would be steel columns and beams with steel stud exterior.
So
That
the actual building would be a big empty cavern.
In a theory, yes. That the steel frame is the steel frame. Think about it, constructing a big warehouse, but we're obviously going to make it look a little bit nicer than a warehouse. But you could move walls around within it, and we found that I think I'm shooting kind of off the top of my head, but I think it was 2 20-foot bays allowed for a department, and then that was that back staff corridor. So you look at that building, and I could bring some examples to you guys that literally all of those rectangles are very similar. Now, I think the only one that strayed away from it was the building department, and they were just 2 bays. So there's some flexibility in there, and I think that's something we would consider looking at a design for you is, maybe we design something and maybe a department is kind of 2 halves, and then down the road, we got to build out phase 2, and now the clerk's department is both of those halves, and that next department kind of shuffles down. So, and we're seeing a lot more of, Georgie had mentioned going through Orion Township. There's defined offices, and then there's a lot of workstations. We have acoustic treatments in there, so people can see, there's visibility. Right now, if I were to go see Mark, you can't see Karen. That's also a safety issue, right? And you got to go down a back corridor for that. Orion Township is a prime example of the public is on one side of the desk. Multiple departments can support one another during a busy time of elections. And if there happen to be an issue, if George is confronting someone at the counter, someone else can, come and say, hey, I think George needs a little help over here, or, come to the rescue there.
I have concerns I have all along about the elevation of the farmstead and what the water table is through there, close proximity to the Swartz Creek drain. We haven't closed on the sale of the, was it 79 acres? Was that the total of it?
49.
Or 49, excuse me. But when we close on that, we could earmark that, and again, this is preliminary discussions. I'm just throwing stuff out there. I like the topography of the land across the road from the farmstead, especially on the corner of Elliott and North Holly. It's more highly elevated. So I'm wondering if we would want to consider taking the proceeds from the sale of the 49 acres and purchase land across the road, which I believe you've had preliminary discussions with the owner.
Yes. I have with Mr. Kupiak on the property across the street.
Mhm.
And at the same time, we're waiting, as you said, for those soil borings to come in. I think if you remember the original master plan for the farmstead, if you're looking at it, it shows the township building close to the north house with the parking lot going north. I think we've already realized that that building will probably be on the north end of that parking lot because, as you said, the slope and the topography, the stormwater runoff would go over to Swartz Creek, and putting the building where the original concept was puts it right in the path of that stormwater. There is a high area, if you remember that original plan where the community garden is.
George, I did pull it up on the screen if that's helpful.
Oh, okay, well, yeah, if you take the building here and flip it over to here, allows the parking lot to come down this way, pushes that over, but this is the high area at the farmstead. And the water runoff then, because Swartz Creek is here, and then it turns and goes that way, but that allows the water runoff. So those are things we're looking at in talking about. And as you said, if you start to look at the property across the street, which incidentally used to be part of this farmstead,
Yes, it did.
if you look at that property, then you start seeing future potential, as you said, for things like a baseball field or a dog park or that type of thing.
DPW
Yes.
building.
Yeah, or in your other buildings. So that is a viable consideration, and that's why we're doing all of this preliminary study as we move along to see what we've got
Correct.
to deal with.
I
Get
kind
all
of
the
mentioned it briefly,
ideas.
but you had contracted HRC to do some due diligence on the site. And even if we had started this recipe and gotten to this today, that would be my first recommendation. So George invited me to a preliminary meeting with them to just say, hey, you know, Scott's doing some work for us, so are you guys. Can we meet with the minds and come up with the best, you know, approach here moving forward? I gave them some insight just on some of these factors that we thought, you know, they didn't know how big of a box we were talking about. You know, the general thoughts that you guys had, you know, can say it's maybe more of a rectangle than a square. You know, those were factors we discussed and gave them a little insight from my perspective of some general locations that I would explore for those preliminary soil borings to get an idea of whether we're building on good land, you know, the water table is high. So that's kind of a general spread. Before we get too far beyond this process and maybe at the end of schematic design or going into DD, we would order additional ones. So we would actually say, okay, that is where the front door is. This is where the handicap spot is. And we would order additional borings for corners so we know that we're not going to get into specialty foundations. Or if we were, you know, could we shift the building 10 feet and avoid that consideration? Orion Township's basement, for example, when we did those final borings, we actually had a partial basement originally programmed, and they decided after those borings came back that, well, we're either going to spend some money and schedule an investment to have the land settled properly, because it was also an old farms site for the Scripps Mansion, actually. And the Scripps family had that land farmed for years. Well, if we decided to just put the whole building on a basement, or better yet, most of it, that was actually, although an overall add to the cost of the project, they gained, I think, 8,500 square feet. So the dollar invested, instead of spending it on specialty foundations or things like that, it was a change in the building program to say, well, we're going to take that. In that case, it was, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? But we're talking about a much larger building, and we're going to invest those dollars for the greatest return on our investment.
So would we want to know where this is going to be located before we get into schematic design?
Schematic design is going to tell us where this wants to be located.
Okay.
That's part of schematic design. We kind of have this recipe we're going to work with, and now we're going to say, hey, here's the beautiful vista, right, of the creek. Here's where the old house is. You obviously have, you're kind of coming into this process with a little bit of a half step or a giant step forward because of the master plan that got put together. But there's probably going to be further considerations. You know, just from a high level standpoint, we typically see some division of space between, let's say, staff parking or DPW parking versus public parking. That doesn't mean it's separated behind a gate. It just means, hey, staff is always coming in and out over here, public's coming in and out over here, versus kind of this concept you see here on the master plan where there's a road, there's a building on one side, and there's the parking on the other. So there's going to be other discussions that we had to say, again, how do we kind of best fit all of these puzzle pieces on this site to have the greatest return?
Even if we were doing the option of exploring across the road?
So I would say this, you know, the primary focus is going to be the building, right? We're going to kind of figure that out. So I think between the two sites, if the second site were to be considered, you're still going to have to kind of figure out what that building is. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I still envision that building being similar, right? This idea that it fits the farmstead, it fits the history of the community. You know, it's not going to stray away vastly. Now, we might have to have some other site exploration, but that's going to be the same thing that as you're going to want to have site due diligence over there too. So I still think it's a valuable resource, and maybe you would consider this plan differently than the other because of all the other master plan components that you see here in the farmstead master plan. You know, by putting in the primary road or having two cuts, you know, off on it that are paved, and you've got some utilities running through here, that kind of helps some of these other functions be a springboard for those. If you go across the street, you know, we're maybe considering other factors, baseball fields, DPW building, you know, that might be a different set of programs. Still a very viable option, but I think you have a lot here that says this is worth exploring and worth considering what, you know, and it's take the next step.
I don't think our design of the building would change. That's
No.
we need to.
That's
move
what he was
forward
saying.
with
Building
that,
would-
right?
The building
It
would
would
be the
just
building, I think,
right.
would come, and even the sake of, let's say, the site and the parking lot. So I hate to keep bringing up Orion Township, but it's just they just turned over the keys less than 8 months ago, right? Is we did slide that building around on that site because we had 77 acres, right? So maybe some of these functions do decide to move because the orchard is more viable to the lowland than the building, right? But the idea of how many parking spaces we need, and there's probably parking on this end and parking out front, those would still be factors that we're gonna kind of take that block and move it across the street, or take that block and move it a little bit different locations on the site, based on what else we want to benefit.
And you need
That makes
the
sense.
schematic part of that
Right, to
before
do
we can
that.
start doing that.
Right.
Correct, so schematic design is, although we can help you with high-level cost estimating, the world is very crazy right now. A schematic design package would be a great opportunity to furthermore kind of your team to bring on that construction side of it. They would be involved just on a preliminary basis, of giving you some costing feedback, but that would be, that package, that schematic design package is a good package to go send out to those and say, would you be interested in being our construction partner? And they could say, yes, we would be. We foresee this to be a X, dollar project. It would be more if you consider all these other barn components, or the 4-H barn on top of it, or you put infrastructure across this entire, property.
I'm also leery of a lease.
Of what?
A lease.
Mhm.
If we were go to a building that we lease.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, to an extent, you're at the mercy of the landlord.
Yeah,
Personal experience from being in business, those landlords can sell the building to somebody else.
Sure.
That can happen. Now you're dealing with not the original landlords that you signed your lease with. You're dealing with a totally new, maybe one person, maybe a group. The
So,
other thing about a lease is that it will have accelerators. It's not going to stay the same from day one, and those are usually built in 3 to 5 year increments. So there's a lot of pitfalls associated with being in a long-term lease. Personally, I would prefer that the township owns the land and owns the building, and that the land is sufficient to accommodate future growth for 50 to 100 years.
yeah, well, we've been in that building for 100 years.
Yeah, exactly. It's 130, right?
Yeah.
130 years old.
Yes.
Definitely got our money's worth out of it.
yeah.
Well,
Seeing how we only paid $3,000 when we built it. That looks ridiculous. Yeah, that looks totally ridiculous today.
No, I agree. I think this is all good questions to be had, and it's just the start. You're scratching the surface of considering this project, and I'm a shameless supporter of historical communities. I live in the village of Lake Orion myself. I plan to raise my family in the village. It's a great community benefit. I think you guys could play an amazing opportunity to downtown. I was just up here. I got out of a meeting early. You got the car show going on down there, and I think that could be an amazing opportunity to the downtown area. And right now, from my perspective, you're kind of fighting yourself on staying in that building. And I think there's a huge resurgence of investment in downtowns, and I think that there could be a really awesome and unique opportunity that gets presented by you considering this other factor. Not to mention, we're not just talking about going and building in the middle of nowhere. You have the Heritage Farm site to build upon. You have the homes that are there. You have clearly a vision of what else it could become. This could be that critical component that maybe there isn't the 4-H barns or the sugar shack right away. Maybe that starts in the Township Hall, and when those services or those programs are robust and busting at the seams, you're like, let's go build that building, right? Let's build the second barn because we need it, and the community is celebrating that component of Holly Township.
Mr. Ruth, you've been quiet this evening.
I have been. No, my questions are probably related. The square footage study ahead of time was well thought about. Where it's going to go and what it's going to look like, I got to see more pictures, I think.
For sure.
And
Yeah.
I need to see physical
Yeah,
buildings.
right. Or I can
Well,
just
and
do
that's
plans,
why,
but
that's why I want to
Yeah.
take, I think, again, when they had their open house, I went to Lake Orion, or to Orion Township, and I toured the facility, And like I said, it is a very large facility. However, if you just stand in front and you realize that the clerk's office has 9 desks, we'd only need 2 or 3, and so forth, you start to see where that size
Yeah,
component.
just the flow, I need to see,
Yeah.
But
you know,
but that's
they
what you
put
see when you're
together
there.
and-
When you walk into their auditorium, what is that seat?
Just shy of 100.
Just shy of 100. You know, we don't need 100 seats in our auditorium. But
Yeah, and there was factors that they considered to expand, those community offerings, right? So you guys are thinking about something maybe with the Farmstead site. Orion Township wanted to provide, because of the size of the community, another community meeting space. So they did provide that room, and that was off of the trailhead at Pollyant Trail. One other factor, I know we keep throwing around the 50,000 square feet of Orion. Keep in mind, too, that about 1/5 of that building, or a little less than 10,000 square feet, is Orion Township's Oakland County substation. So that was another factor there. So their general main floor square footage is about 20,000.
I don't know what it looks like inside, but commercial buildings today are generally open, your steel post type.
yeah,
Yes.
it does. That's why I say I'd
And
like
they have
to.
desks, with walls up to about 8 feet, and it's open, the top's not, there's a door on it, but it's not closed.
Correct.
And then there's private offices as well. And those open areas can be really rearranged or downsized up or down. You don't need much space for a computer and a file cabinet and stuff like that.
And the goal is, I'm picking on you, Karen, right? But Karen's been in the township for a long time and arguably kind of made it work with the facility that she's been provided. So when she's got the code book, right, that George might reference once in a while and you reference every day, is that really needed to be in the overhead by her desk? Probably not. It probably needs to be in a common area. We just kind of made it happen. So I think not only that, we're right-sizing some of those areas to provide the right space. And then on top of that, we're going to be providing natural daylighting. There'd be, a very considerable, and reasonable investment would be sit-stand desks, somewhere where you're attracting, you're a viable employer, not only as a government service, but just as an employer in your region. And then, the other piece I was going to say is, from a just wellness standpoint, that building, we're talking about building something larger. Orion Township, with the systems that are in place and LED lights and HVAC that has an economizer cycle, and I could lose you guys real quickly, right? But it's the fact that just because you're making this investment doesn't mean it's costing the township more to operate that. If anything, some of those costs might come down, especially significantly when you're factoring, you're heating an old 100-year plus building that's, double the space that you're really utilizing.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'm set. Yep.
Any more comments? Mark? Eric?
The only other thing I'll have to add is, we talked about this, and if this is what it's going to look like, the community centers, I guess, if you will, that are inside this building. I think as you go to several township halls up north, those township halls are used for a huge variety of things. Wild game dinners, I've been to several of those at several different township halls. And it's really a community meeting place is what it's seen as. And I think that'd be an important piece to make sure we have, if this is the route we go, just so there's, this is our spot.
Yep. That's another nice part about the Farmstead location. If you look at the map of Holly Township and think about it as a dartboard, you throw your dartboard, hit the bullseye, you've hit this property.
Right. That's correct.
It's smack dab.
There was one comment, the SEMCOG that said we're only going to grow 1% in the next 20 years. Is that?
When did you see that?
That's in
It
here.
was in one of these
okay.
documents.
Page 3.
So
One?
you had
Yeah.
so
That seemed pretty light.
We know
I just
that.
finished our master plan. I'm a planning commissioner in Orion Township, and SEMCOG data was maybe, sorry about that. Okay, that arguably was, maybe a little off, and some of that was they're not seeing the application for the 100+ homes that you have on the docket right now.
Right.
Right.
Well,
So that's
it,
just
yeah.
general
That's just
projections,
it, yeah.
right? So that's why it's there as a
But it
community-based
says
data
20
point.
years.
Right.
They would have to anticipate stuff like that.
Yeah.
If it's,
Yep.
Well, I was going to say, just with the one development, if you consider it's over 300 right now. But if you were just consider 300 at 2.5 people,
Right.
and I always wonder which half of the person moves in the bottom half. But regardless, but at 2.5 people, you're looking at 750 people there.
Yeah.
That's more than 1% of a 12,000
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
So, and that doesn't include another 400 homes in Holly Hills
Right.
projected.
Yes.
So now you're at 700
Yeah,
homes.
they just obviously didn't
What's
do
the back of
their
Riverside?
homework.
What's the back of Riverside Gardens? What's
Oh,
the
yeah, that's another.
what's the next part of Riverside North?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got those four that are that aren't thought about. They're actually there and just going through the steps to get going.
Exactly.
And
The 49 acres that we're selling is eventually going to be.
yeah, so you're looking at over 1,000 residential units,
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and I was gonna say I would,
probably before the next census.
for sure.
Right.
I think you're gonna see a jump. I can see it happening, and
So Steve, you don't even have to worry about 20 years.
Well, I know. If this is based on 1%, that's not enough.
I think a lot of that I think is based on them monitoring the growth for the previous 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And we did not grow
right.
like when they first put I-75 in,
Right.
and Holly had 3 exits. Maple, East
Yeah.
Holly Road,
Mm-hmm.
Grange Hall, North Holly Road. And they thought Holly was just going to explode.
Right.
Didn't happen.
Well, keep in mind too, I mean, that's some background information that I consider, but, I'm also listening to Karen and all of your staff that's sitting here, seeing where the community might go. And that's the key here in this,
That's
projection
how-
is
Yeah, we talked about it in detail, and that's where
Yeah.
we came up with the size.
right. In a way, I'm suggesting almost double the staff. Is that tomorrow? Probably not. But if in a new facility, we need to consider that as a factor, right? Because realistically, with, let's say, arguably at least 1,000 homes on the docket, could the clerk really do her role or his role, right, and still maintain the building department? That needs to probably be dissected to another department and support that
Well, and
accordingly.
we're already feeling those growing pains
We
now.
are, yeah.
Yeah. So
So-
We're working on that.
we're having conversations on that.
All set?
Are we good here?
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you
That was
ever,
great.
thank you
Scott,
very
I
much
want to
for the
thank you for your
opportunity.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you very much.
I want to. Oh, I did have one last note here. Somewhere in here, I don't know that I saw square footage for staff space, and by that I mean when they come in the morning, a place to hang the coat, a lunchroom,
Oh, yeah.
That
a
would be,
break room, whatever you want to call it.
that would be in some of that support space that's in there.
The gray space.
Yeah, the gray space. How we further define some of those, you'll see, like in schematic design, right? I foresee this building being more than just that 7,900 or 8,000, right? And some of that would be is maybe moving storage down to the basement or to a less desirable area of the building to create some of those functions. And to that point, George, I think it'd be very useful if you guys decide to proceed, to do some tours and to go through some buildings and lessons learned of a building that's 10 years old or something that's been constructed. I mean, Orion Township has a pretty vast cafe employee space, but it also was a space that all staff could congregate for a training, right? So there were some other functions that were presented there, and that's one thing that I like to pride ourselves on is not to just say, yep, well, it's George's. It's kind of, well, it's a staff common area. You can get double dollars for what you put in.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity. I appreciate
All
it.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Under the workshop business, we also want to talk about the township audit update. Derek, did you want to share with the board?
Yeah, so I have reached out to 4 companies. I reached out to Yo and Yo. They had declined to accept us as a client. I've reached out to Lewis and Knopf. We also did not have any success with them. Reached out to Plant Moran. They said we were too small. And then I reached out to Anderson Tackman, who is the one that does audits where I work. He will get me a proposal by the meeting date, the regular scheduled meeting date for this month.
Anderson what?
Anderson Tackman.
Did
Tackman?
he-
Yeah.
Well, I put out a bid proposal, so does he have all the information he needs?
I can
So
see if
he
he's
did-
got the bid
right.
proposal.
And
Yeah.
I've sent to all those other ones that you just said as well.
Okay.
Um,
So, in the meantime, we weren't aware that you were doing that.
Mhm.
Karen and I have been talking to a couple of companies, specifically Plant Moran. We've had three
Right,
meetings
and
now.
they're, so the bids are due by 4 o'clock tomorrow.
Right, but with Plant Moran, we were talking about a process. You mentioned that they said that they wouldn't do it. Well, I brought that up in our last meeting with them, and they said that there was some confusion as to how you interpreted whatever they said. They have a process in which they help, a system, if you will, as far as the way we handle the accounting and so forth, and that's what they would work with. And then what Plant Moran does, because of separation, so that, they're not overseeing both, then they have auditors that are smaller companies that work, because once their system is done, then the audit becomes much simpler, just short of pushing a button and everything falls in place.
Right.
So it's not that they don't do it, but it's part of their process. They just hand it off to a
There's
smaller
better fit
CPA.
for us right now for
Mhm.
services that we need, and then we'll transition to them
Yep.
after we're done with that, and we can get all the bank reconciliations
Yep,
all done, and
but
the
we'll
fact
have,
that we're this far behind is presented us a real problem with getting anybody
Well,
to bid.
part of what I was hoping you would say, and you didn't, but one of these companies said they didn't want to do it because of,
Well, there were several reasons for one of these. Yo and Yo had said based on audits of the past, findings that they had, and then also due to a 6/30 year-end date. They do a lot of schools, and that presented a problem for them as well.
that's June 30th, not
June
not the
30th.
time of our meeting. Just wanted to
Correct.
clarify.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, so,
So I had used the, not only did I send it, but see, I emailed your company that you had suggested, and they never got back with me.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I didn't include them in this round of requests. So I did an original request, and then I went to the state of Michigan, talked to them. They gave me a list, which the Yo and everybody
Mhm.
that you had said were
Mhm.
included in that.
Okay.
And so I sent them bids and then included, how many years we wanted, and gave them copies of our current budget and all that kind of stuff, so.
Mm-hmm.
so we'll be seeing that at the board meeting next Wednesday.
Yep.
Okay?
So have we had any other responses other than potentially the Sanderson Tech one then? And
just
all the
Plan
other ones I
Moran.
mentioned? Okay.
Yeah,
Which will be a secondary company, a subsidiary of Plan Moran.
no, it'll be.
No,
they
it'll
will
be
go out
Plant
and help
Moran.
us. Yeah, it'll
It'll
be
be
Plant
Plant
Moran to
Moran.
start, and then they'll work in conjunction with companies they've worked with before to provide us this, at least, the year behind and this year together in conjunction.
And they gave us completion dates of December 31st and March 31st respectively. But Plant Moran does the bulk. Through their
So-
process, they do the bulk of the
So
audit.
they really.
So when the CPA comes in, it's just pretty simple stuff.
Right, so if they want to bid, they really need to interview with me. So to get the information they need, so that they're actually providing apples to apples, and they really know what we need.
Because I know basically what all these people told me was that they're going to be looking at previous audits we've had, go through all the information that was presented during those audits, and that's where they would be getting the information from.
Okay.
So
Okay, so any questions on that? We're good?
No.
All right, then we'll go into our last public comment. None appearing. We can adjourn the meeting.
Speak up.
We don't want to hear you.
You're right.
Because
We're done.
anytime I've looked at you, you go no. So if you want to speak, it'll be a first.
No, I'm good.
Yeah, see? You just want to be asked.
I'll just talk to you later.
Okay, we'll close the meeting at 7:50.